lot of centres now have auto belays, True Blues or whatever belay auto belay system that you use. And certainly prior to lockdown, obviously going back 12 months, in the year up to that, so 2019, certainly there are a number of us, as in technical advisors, that were concerned at the number of accidents and near misses involving use, or rather, misuse of auto belays. So I think I'd really like to just chat through, as briefly as I can, what's gone on with regards to those. And I actually am aware of another one since I put this presentation together that happened, in between both of the lockdowns. So, these are not isolated incidents; they're things that are relatively regular. And it might be that folks in the webinar have also had been party. Looking at the names in the list, I know of a couple of incidents where folks have had direct interaction with incidents that have gone on that very similar to what I'm going to chat through here. So, number one, and I guess the most serious, most potentially serious, is people not being attached to auto belays at all, i.e. not clipping in and climbing. And we're seeing a relatively similar pattern in terms of what the demographic of those wall users is. And certainly the people that have been more seriously injured, they have all fitted this demographic. And, you wouldn't be surprised to know that they're generally, experienced climbers operating on their own, quite often where the walls are relatively quiet, and they might be doing laps on a particular line, and perhaps they're distracted, maybe listening to music, maybe other distractions, and they just fail to attach. Now, I haven't got statistics for the amount of people that I've noticed and climbed down, although I do, all the anecdotes are kind of out there. We've had people that have noticed and climbed down and gone to kind of confess at reception, which is great to know. We've had people that have noticed, climbed down, and gone home and stewed about it, and come back into the centre the following day and ring up and go, I'm really sorry, you need to know that this happened. And then, of course, there are all the ones that we don't know about. And what's the percentage that goes alongside that? We don't know. We couldn't even kind of work that one out. There have been a few rescues that I'm aware of, but often the events happen too quickly in terms of people not noticing, or noticing and other things have happened along the way that it then turns into an accident. And certainly I've dealt with some really serious ground falls, with people pretty badly injured, generally falling, as you would expect, from the top of the wall, obviously not knowing really until they actually let go and see that they're not attached. So that's a real concern. So, my obligation as safety advisor, safety expert for a facility is to look at those incidents and say, well, okay, this isn't something we can just carry on as we've always done, hoping that it's not going to happen. So putting some control measures in place, working with additional control measures was needed in all of those circumstances. So, things for you to think about, practical tools, without going into kind of drilling into the detail of exactly what we've done in all the various facilities. I think route setting is a major thing, and certainly a couple of the more serious incidents that I've dealt with, we've kind of looked at it and really found that easier routes were starting actually outside of triangles, the kind of blue belay gates or whatever people use at their facilities. So a really easy control measure in place there is to look at that, crumbs. How did people manage to climb without clipping in? Well, they managed to climb without clipping in because the footholds and handholds at the start of the route were climbable without moving the belay gate out of the way. So you're going to see obvious things like that. Making sure belay gates are really big. And again, we've experimented at a couple of centres with actually having some bespoke, monstrous belay gates made. And certainly in those centres, that has negated any problems up until now since we put those in. So that's something to consider as well. Good signage, really good signage is important. You need to let folks know and remind them what they should be doing. And some centres will also include that as a kind of compulsory test descent. And certainly in the new ABC auto belay induction video that some of you may have seen, that is something that's included within that. So, be aware that's something that happens, and, it happens relatively frequently. More often than not, people preempt it, climb down and sort themselves out. But there've been enough accidents for us to be really concerned, to be suitably concerned about that. So that's the more experienced users. In the middle there then, we've got the people that perhaps are less experienced. Maybe they're using higher equipment from the centre, and they fail to attach themselves to the correct part of the harness, the belay loop. So we've got a combination there of people, competent, effectively centre users that hire the harness and they've clipped themselves into the wrong part of the harness. More concerning, we've got folks that are supervising others, potentially children, and clipping them into the wrong part of the harness. And my comic side, it always amazes me what people can actually do and what they can kind of work out to connect to. And I'm not going to allude that now. That's the sort of thing we go into into a practical in-person training course. But if there's something for people to clip into, they've probably done it. Interestingly enough, people automatically think about gear loops. I've never dealt with an accident on an auto belay where someone's clipped into a gear loop. It's far more obscure places to the harness that they tend to choose. They usually result in ground falls because generally the participants are less experienced and they're kind of not aware of what's gone on, and they can't really self-help. And then there is just one case that I've come across that unfortunately was on a supervised session where a member of staff failed to attach someone to an auto belay in a kind of clip and climb style setting there. And coming back to my first presentation earlier on this afternoon, did the duty of care exist? Yes. Was there a lapse in that duty of care? Well, yes, the member of staff failed to clip the child in. Did that lapse in duty of care have a direct impact on the injury? The child fell from the top of the wall and broke both legs. So that was really kind of clear, and there was a settlement, a relatively large settlement kind of connected to that. So those are all things that are going on all of the time. The lemons theory is the thing we call it, isn't it? It's all going on all of the time. Now, to add to that, we've had a funny year, to say the least. Climbing walls have been closed for a massive proportion, haven't they, of last year, and haven't opened at all this year. And I think, from a preemptive point of view, from a preventative point of view, we really need to embrace that fact that people are going to come back to our climbing centres, and they're going to have things that they're going to have forgotten about. There's going to be rust around the edges, skills fade, whatever you like to call it. And there are going to be some really good little articles and videos and things to support this coming out really soon, certainly before facilities are reopen. Gav, I think, who's in the webinar here, wrote a really good article in the Professional Mountaineer about skills fade. John, who's also in the group, who's in the webinar today, has put a great article together for Summit Magazine that will come out next month, I think. So it's worthwhile absorbing all of those things. But I suppose that's not my job to kind of look at the big picture. Let's kind of focus in on what's been going on. What have these concerns been over the past 12 months? And really, when centres originally opened again in July, I think staff had really good input. They were kind of they were really on the ball. They were pretty sharp, and centres perhaps they weren't as busy as people expected them to be. And we didn't really see anything different than we'd normally see in terms of incidents and near misses. If anything, I'd say, perhaps a little bit less. However, during September, October, we had a particular week where there was a real spike in incidents. And this particular week, I mean, a lot of you here will be members of the ABC, or at least following the ABC on Facebook and Instagram. You'll see actually it pushed me to do something quite unusual and to put a press release out on those platforms, just saying to folks, look, this is going on, and without putting it in black and white, someone's going to kill themselves, sooner rather than later. The statistics are not looking good. And this particular week, we had 8 incidents where people decked out. One of them was from the top of the wall, all based around lead climbing. Although it wasn't the climbing that necessarily damaged people, it was the poor or lack of belaying. And I suppose that the other concern is that none of these people were inexperienced, and none of them had, they'd all rephrased that, they'd all been climbing relatively regularly, climbing and belaying since centres reopened in July. So it wasn't a case that people had 6 months off and they were rusty. They'd had 6 months off and they'd been climbing like mad things, and then things had happened. Now, as we'll look at later on in this presentation, when we're looking into incidents like this, having something like CCTV footage is really useful. It's completely impartial. It shows you as the investigator what has actually gone on here, assuming you've got to zoom in and the angles are right. Now, that coupled with witness statements is pretty reliable in terms of seeing exactly what's happened. So the things that I kind of pulled out of all of these incidents, no 2 of them are exactly the same, but there were factors that were kind of common across a few of them. Poor belayer position seemed to feature quite highly, i.e. people standing way too far from the wall, particularly for the first few clips, the first 3 or 4 clips, i.e. belayer position, and then my second point, too much slack, rendering an effective belay kind of null and void. So people decking out basically from the first few clips. That was also kind of interlinked with just a general lack of concentration from the belayer, and that particularly gets well picked up from CCTV. Witness statements kind of struggle to pick that sort of factor up, but on CCTV you can pull that out. So poor positioning, too much slack in the system, no concentration. It's a recipe for a problem, really, isn't it? The lemons are kind of going round. And then something else that's been thrown into the mix, is also introducing a new tool into the mix for belayers, which effectively is a face mask, isn't it? So belayers are wearing face masks. Now, we are still doing some investigations into this. And as, like I say, Johnny's written an article that's going to go in Summit. Certainly Libby, Peter and I, we're currently doing some investigations and experiments into face mask wearing, and particularly lead belaying, and what the issues are around that. Things like fogging up glasses, not being able to see your hands on the belay device, which for less experienced belayers, could be a factor. Where's the rope being stacked on the floor? Is that going to cause problems moving around if people have got obscured vision due to face mask wearing? So that's a kind of hot topic that's being discussed at the moment, and we're playing around with. But just the fact I've kind of brought it up here to say to folks, things are different, and sometimes people struggle to cope when things are slightly different, even if they're only slightly different. So, it's worth putting that into the mix kind of as an awareness. So, what do we know then about the coming year? Well, when the wall's going to open, that's the question. We don't know that. But what we do know is that a lot of climbers will have had a break. That might not be a break from climbing and belaying all over, particularly if folks have got access to outdoors from home, but they are going to have a break from operating a climbing wall. No one is going to have climbed a climbing wall. No one is going to have belayed in a climbing wall. So we know that there's going to be rust, with folks coming back into that environment. Rust, skills fade, you know, whatever we like to call it. I think the second factor here, you know, be aware as well, people are going to be a little bit frazzled, they're going to be emotionally exhausted, much more so than in your normal year. So throwing all of these factors, again, the lemons into the mix, that's something that we need to have quite clearly in our minds. Throwing that into the third point is that people are going to be pretty excited, aren't they? People are going to be psyched, I would imagine, to get back to your centres. So, you know, we throw those three factors together, don't we? People have had a break. People are going to be a little bit frazzled by the whole thing, but they're going to be super psyched. That potentially is going to cause problems. Now, I don't have any solutions for those areas, but I think awareness, you know, is as much as anything else. So, you know, that's about customers, isn't it? Don't forget the staff. You know, the staff are not exempt. And when I say staff, that applies to everyone, doesn't it? Everyone that's on this webinar today are not exempt from those three factors of having time off, being a bit frazzled, and being really excited to get back to things. So you could almost argue that, you know, dealing with the staff is perhaps more important in the first instance than the customers, but really both of those should be hand in hand. I think you forget about one group and that's going to cause problems in the long run. So, you know, that's my kind of the COVID bit. I haven't written COVID in any slides because I think we're all pretty fed up with it now. But I think kind of people understand where we're going with that. So moving on then, and let's put COVID and lockdown and all that kind of thing to one side. I've got a couple of very brief, interesting case studies. Hopefully you'll find them interesting, which both of them have just got a little useful learning point, I think, that people can kind of take away. And I'll run through them as briefly as I can. So both are in bouldering centres, but the fact they're in bouldering centres doesn't matter whether they're in rope centre or, you know, auto belay or whatever, it wouldn't really make any difference. So case number one was a group supervised session in a, you know, relatively big bouldering centre with a qualified coach. And the session was being run in a normal way, nothing strange, nothing unusual. All the participants had filled in waivers, or they're all under 18, so parents had filled in waivers and consent forms, and there was nothing that was kind of wrong about that. Unfortunately, a participant fell and broke a bone, which, you know, that's an outcome, isn't it? It's a potential outcome of a bouldering session. It's unfortunate it's happened on the supervised session, but as we know, it's not completely avoidable. Now, in this particular case, the parents did take it further. They did take the wall to task over it. And the stumbling block, the issue that kind of went around, is that the only thing that kind of demonstrated what the activity was going to be on the form was the BMC participation statement, which we're all aware of. You know, we could all read it off. And the question that came back, as well as all of the other questions that the solicitors will ask, was really that if they felt that the participant and their next of kin hadn't been informed of unroped climbing, so bouldering wasn't mentioned within that acknowledgement of risk. It was climbing and mountaineering. Now that did get a little bit messy, that case, and it was settled in the end. It kind of didn't go all the way. But I think it was a really, you know, an important thing for folks to bear in mind. And I know there've been ABC mail shots about it, certainly 12 months ago, 18 months ago. And I just reinforce what Kath mentioned just before lunch, that the ABC now have produced a whole raft of new acknowledgement of risk formats and forms that, if you remember, you know, you've got access to, that kind of expand on all of these areas that potentially have caused or could cause problems, have caused problems in the past, that could cause problems in the future. So, you know, again, I'm not saying what's right and what's wrong there. I think that's not for a kind of webinar, but I think it's a really, the message there is make sure you're kind of reviewing what you're doing and review your paperwork, and it matches what current thinking is. And if you don't know what current thinking is, the ABC of the body to kind of give you that information. So that was case one. So the message there is, if you haven't looked at your paperwork recently and your processes, now is a good time as any to review those before you reopen again, within the next, hopefully, couple of months. So that was a process one. Slightly different circumstances and a slightly different outcome. Again, I'll just talk you through this one. Again, Bouldering Center, this was actually a multi-use centre, but the guys had decided they were going to go bouldering at the end of the session. They'd been rope climbing. The supervised adult was very fit and able, very sporty, and they just learned to belay, and they were going to boulder at the end of the session. They were a bit tired, but that was thought to be fine. The lady fell off from a really low level, from the sort of kind of starting footholds of an easy boulder problem, and said she was suffering from back pain. So 999 was called by the centre staff, and after 3 hours, I think, the participant with back pain decided to cancel 999. Certainly, instructed the centre staff to cancel 999 and hobble out to the car. And got our friends to drive her to A&E. Now, okay, that's one set of things that you could look at and kind of review and work out how to improve on. But unfortunately, it was quite a bad injury, and she ended up fusing 3 vertebrae. Now, they hadn't quite got to the bottom of it, whether it was the moving to the car that actually caused that, or whether it was the fall from the bouldering wall that caused that, and how are we going to know that? But certainly movement would have given complications. Now, she was good with all that, but certainly when the centre investigated it, they found out that actually this particular group of ladies, they hadn't filled in any supervision forms. So there was a failing at reception in terms of their own processes for getting the relevant paperwork filled in. Now, that's quite a live case. So I can't kind of give you any more information on that. But again, just to remind folks that the previous case was, make sure your processes are right in the first place and everything is as contemporary as possible. Case number 2 says to me, okay, you can have the best systems in place, but if they're not enforced and not used effectively, that will also cause you problems. So, hopefully those messages are kind of pretty clear to folks. So, what if it all goes wrong? Now, this really is worst case scenario. So I don't want people kind of falling off their chair with panic. And, I always look to the sentencing guidelines. What's the worst thing that could happen in a climbing centre? And that inevitably is, is a death of a young person, isn't it? Particularly if they're on a supervised session. And actually, that could cause all sorts of problems, couldn't it, for you, for the centre, for the owners, etc. And I only take you back to the Lyme Bay incident, which many people remember in 1993. I remember coming home from school, and my mum and dad, I was into canoeing at the time, and my mum and dad sat me down in front of the news to say, whoa, look what's just gone on here. And of course, 4 young people died. And that was the first case of corporate manslaughter in the UK. The guy got 3 years, the manager of the centre got 3 years custodial sentence. And there was a pretty hefty fine as well. And of course, that was the start of the Adventure Activity Licensing Authority, which doesn't relate to climbing centres, but nevertheless, relates to educational visits. So, it's worth having that hanging in people's minds that, what's the worst thing that can happen? Well, that's probably the worst thing that can happen. And there is a precedent that's been set. And all of the HSE fines and guidelines and things are completely there in the public domain. So you can see what the implications would be if we got one of those things wrong and, duty of care was kind of lacking. Now, in reality, what is more likely to be the case is going to be some sort of breach in health and safety at Work Act, or the relevant act that relates to the country and place that you're operating in. And I think, excuse me, the message there to folks, and again, this is always a worry when I go to centres and explain to folks that this is a potential thing that can happen, is, HSE, health and safety fines, are unlimited. There's no cap on them. Now, obviously, things would have to be very, very serious for them to be very, very high, but that is completely possible in a climbing centre. There was certainly a case that I dealt with a couple of years ago that related to a major activity provider, not a climbing centre, but an activity centre. And actually their fine was calculated on percentage turnover, which for this particular company was a lot of money. I can't disclose what it was, but it was a lot of money. And at worst, HSC fines can also include imprisonment too. So, that's the worst case scenario. I don't want people losing sleep over it. But I think it's always worth having that in the back of your mind, that this is stuff that isn't completely escapable in our environment. So that's the bad bit. So let's give you the information then to try and prevent that from happening. What are the things that we should be doing? So, obligations, but also things we'd expect you to be able to have, prove, or show if there was an accident. Number one, as always, and we've been saying it through the day today, haven't we? So Nate's gone on about it this morning, and I've mentioned it at length this afternoon as well. Keep excellent records. So, witness statements from everyone that's possibly been involved, participants and staff, and make sure they're as thorough as possible and they're kept on file. And, get those done as soon as you physically possibly can after an incident. You really don't want people going away and thinking about it and forgetting the detail. It's definitely worth thinking about what you're going to do with any equipment that was involved in an incident. Now, my advice would be, and in an ideal world, that equipment should be quarantined and then potentially inspected by a competent person. And ideally, even if you don't think perhaps equipment was at fault, that would be always the advice. Now, customer equipment is a little bit more difficult, isn't it, to quarantine? But certainly, recently, I've dealt with a couple of snapped ropes, not completely snapped, but kind of sheathed ropes. And they've really just had to be, taken from customers in consultation with customers to be kind of looked at in detail and just advised that they're not going to be used. At worst, if there was I'll call it a real equipment failure, it might well be that you get the BMC technical committee involved in that as well. So if it's centre kit, that's easy to do. If it's customer kit, you're going to just have to have that conversation with the customer concerned. If it's a bouldering incident, thinking about checking things that could potentially be a causative factor. So that might be holds. Nate's mentioned about holds and pinning holds and all of that kind of thing this morning. So it's well worth checking. And I'll say to folks also photograph things. So you've got all of that evidence there to show that the centre or individuals concerned were not at fault. It's definitely worth looking at the matting as well. And I know Nate's very, very kind of up on matting testing and things like that. And I think more than anything I see in terms of a wide range at centres is people's approach to inspecting matting. What is appropriate? What's a flat spot? And actually who's inspected it and what sort of input have they had in order to perform that inspection? What about splits, and things like that. So, I would always, if I felt there was no problem with the matting involved, again, get some proof, take a photograph, or at least document an inspection to show that wasn't a problem. That would be something I think really quite difficult to prove or unprove if there was an incident and an injury that potentially implicated matting quality. And I'm not aware that certainly in contemporary times has happened, but I think that would be quite a tricky case to kind of deal with. Number 5, and this comes back to a little bit my last little bouldering accident. check the customer's paperwork. You know, and I say paperwork, but also, you know, Rockgym Pro, whatever platform that you're using. Were they doing the thing that they'd been signed off or acknowledged to do? Or actually, was there something strange going on? They were supposed to be bouldering, but they jumped on the auto belays. I'd prefer to find that information out sooner rather than later, than when they come back in 2 weeks' time and go, oh, crumbs, actually, I didn't realise I shouldn't have been doing that. I like to have all the information from kind of day one. I mentioned before, CCTV footage is just massively useful. You know, it's worth getting hold of that. It's worth mentioning though, depending on the systems that folks have got in your centres, it's not impossible that the server might be quite small, and sometimes they only hold a certain amount of days or weeks footage. So, you know, certainly part of my protocol is if the CCTV present and used is to get that downloaded and saved as soon as is physically possible. And I'll also, you know, suggest to you on that, folks, it's worthwhile trying to capture a customer's whole visit to the centre on that download, i.e. when they've walked through the door and everything that's gone on up to when the accident has happened. We had quite a nasty, last year or the year before, auto belay incident at a big multipurpose centre where a guy come into the centre and effectively he'd actually clipped in to the little rope retainer that runs between the leg loops underneath the belay loop. And he hadn't checked, he had quite a big belly and he'd sort of scraped the auto belay carabiner up. It clipped into something. It's just something wasn't the belay loop, so he got to the top of the wall, leant back and hit the floor, obviously, when the whole thing ripped open. So, okay, it happened, but as a snapshot, it doesn't really give us a lot of information about the lead up to it. So rewinding on the hour that he was into the centre beforehand, it transpired he'd hired a hire harness from reception. He was trying to put it on whilst on the phone. And it actually took him 4 goes to get the harness on roughly the right way round. But obviously it still wasn't the right way round because the leg loops had gone through the belay loop, hence him clipping into the little retainer. So that was the kind of hour leader that painted quite a big picture in terms of how that happened. And that actually went into a little bit more staff training for reception staff handing out PPE. So CCTV is good, and it tells you stuff that you're just not going to know if you're just relying on staff and witness statements and what customers have told you. And then the final point on my slide there is, you know, do we follow these things up? And again, I'm not kind of prepared to give my advice on that in terms of what I would say to centres. I see both approaches going on, from really thorough follow-up. Let's ring you, let's check you're okay. We're going to ring you tomorrow as well. You know, are you okay when you're going to come back to the centre? Through to no contact whatsoever. Both models exist. Again, it's for you and your centre to decide what's appropriate for you and what you feel comfortable with. Okay. And that really comes on to my final slide of the afternoon. And this is the positive bit, isn't it? This is the thing that I want you to kind of go away remembering. And this is the slide that I guess if any of them, you should come back to and go, yeah, we're doing that, or maybe we're not. So how can we prevent these things from happening? Let me have a swig of tea. Okay, number 1, have a great induction process. Whatever that process is, and again, I'm not going to, you know, give you my opinion. I've told you what the options are, I've laid them out, but whatever you do, make sure you do it well, make sure it's consistent, make sure staff are trained and aware to deal with it, and to scrutinise any kind of paperwork bit that goes with that, or through the platform that you're using. So that really is, make sure you're giving customers the information that they're going to need to use your centre. It's as simple as that. I think if you miss out an area there, a facility that you've got that customers are going to use, that could cause problems for you down the line. So make it thorough, make sure it covers everything that folks are going to do within your centre. Number 2, we can't guarantee customers are going to remember that or adhere to it or be able to do it forever. So have really good, well-trained staff that can monitor and assist the customers. So whether we call them floor walkers, or it doesn't really matter what we call them, but really, you want someone to keep an eye on what's going on with your customers. And that is, even more important in the light of this year and lockdown and people being a bit rusty. Number 3, have a near-miss reporting system and keep really, really good records and make it easy for staff to report near misses. If they've got to log on to the system and got to remember passwords and go into Excel spreadsheets and remember what the code is for an unthreaded back DMM Alpine harness, they're not going to do it. They're going to forget. So have a system that works, that's easily usable, that is kept on file as a recording and maybe put onto some sort of server, but make sure the staff that are on the ground, the floor walkers, can report those incidents easily. And then added on to that, make sure the staff have been trained. So if there are problems and someone does get a DMM higher harness and Alpine with the old thread buckle, and they do climb to the top of the wall and realise it's not done up, have the staff had training to know what to do with that. If people haven't clicked on an auto belay, have the staff had training to know what to do with that. So give the staff the skills that they're going to need to deal with the facilities that you've got. Point number 4. Again, really relevant this year, isn't it? Don't be afraid to refresh customers. Now, that could take a whole variety of different forms, but certainly a really positive, one of my local climbing walls, something they've been doing over the last couple of years, certainly with the older customers that they tend to see on midweek mornings, there's been such a concern that the standard of belaying had got to a point where it was so potentially unsafe, they decided to run some belay club sessions with them free of charge to just kind of get that belaying back up to speed. And actually a really positive spin-off within that is that they introduced things like Mammoth Smarts and ATC pilots as a geometry-assisted device with, perhaps additional braking function. And the offshoot of that, everyone that came to the belay club went and bought one of these funky new devices, and they use them and they can all belay properly now. So don't be afraid to do things like that. Almost there. Near misses. Tell customers what's going on. A really great thing, and I'll tell you the more concern because you can probably look on their Facebook page and have a look yourselves. Red Point in Worcester, Red Point Climbing Centre in Worcester in England, decided that they'd start collating near misses and actually putting them together every month and publishing them on Facebook to tell customers what had been found out during that period. And it was taken in such a positive way by the customers, and the implications or the impact definitely saw a reduction in some of the more common near misses that were being picked up by floor walkers. So I mean, I just think that's a brilliant thing to do, isn't it? Not being kind of nervous about letting folks what's going on at your centre, letting folks know what's going on at your centre, actually saying, look, we have had X amount of people do tie on through the incorrect part of the harness this month. Be aware of that. And the demographic was X. So that was great. It's on their Facebook page. You can have a look at that. Thinking about signage at your centres. So if you have got, regular issues that are coming up, regular problems, maybe it's with certain user groups or maybe it's certain areas of the centre, why not tell folks about them and remind them? So clear signs. The ABC have got all of these signs that are available to you free of charge. They're really clear and they're really user-friendly. So, I'd say use them. And my final point is, perhaps the most important of the lot, do not ignore serious incidents, serious near misses, or patterns of near misses that are getting reported to you. You can have the best, most well-staffed, trained staff. You can have the best induction process on the planet. You can have the most sophisticated near-miss reporting system in place. But if you don't review it and you don't act on it and you don't make changes to how you operate, the rest of it is kind of null and void. So collect the information and deal with that information. So whether that's operational change, whether it's staff training, whether it's customer education. And all of those things on my final slide, that's the recipe for a safe as possible, successful climbing centre, isn't it? Rather than more than anything else. And that kind of summarises everything else really that I've chatted about this afternoon. Brilliant. Thanks for listening, folks. Loads of information there again, and I know you're going to get copies of all these slides. So, that last one in particular, I think folks will find quite useful as an aid memoir. Wow, bang on time. That's unusual for me. Usually I overrun massively. We've got questions again, folks, and hopefully we're going to have loads more great ones like we did in the previous. We've got something about Red Point's near miss reporting. Brilliant. That's from Mike. Good to see you, Mike. Yep. I'm surprised more facilities haven't done that, actually, reporting near misses. I think it was a really bold starter for 10. And not covering up what actually is going on, I think is really great. It'd be great to see more walls adopting that process.
So yeah, it's a bunch of questions coming through. I'll just go with the first one from John Garside, John the BMC.
Hi, John.
This is something John has kind of brought up in a few of the meetings that we've been having as well, kind of the difference between a near miss and an incident. So I guess what John is saying, a climber realizing they're not attached to an auto belay before leaving the ground and then fixing the issue as a near miss, then realizing this on a climb and then safely down climbing is an incident. There was clearly a poor outcome as they did not intend to climb unattached. Then not getting hurt is simply good fortune. Both of these examples are commonly considered near misses, as the norm can be to consider something an incident only if there is an injury. How as an industry can we better identify incidents and use them to inform practice? Yeah,
completely agree. Yeah. It's we can only get better at this, at sharing what's going on, can't we? And I can encourage certainly the facilities that I deal with, I've got influence in, and other people in the webinar here, hopefully today you'll also be going away thinking, oh crumbs, it'd actually be really good if we were a little bit more open and honest about what's actually going on. And that's the only way we can pile this information together, to put new strategies in place and to educate people effectively. If we don't know if what's happening in X climbing wall only stays in X climbing wall, there's no kind of greater good benefit there. And we want to know, don't we? I mean, John, you're there, you want to know what's going on. We frequently have conversations about things that we've seen and have happened. But that's a narrow, it's one bit of experience and one bit of exposure. So it's just all about sharing information, isn't it, more than anything else, and having a good system in place for collating that information in the first place. So if you haven't at the moment, it's definitely worth giving that some serious consideration.
Cool, thanks, Joey. I'm going to maybe skip over the next question for a little bit later. Question from a bouldering centre. We just replaced a large area of matting, about a quarter of the centre. The new matting is firmer to land on than old, although the old was still in very good condition. Any advice about preempting accidents?
Definitely, and that's a really good point, actually. And no doubt, I mean, it might be something Nate wants to pull up again in a few minutes when he comes in. But certainly I was doing a little kind of tour around a few walls with one of the insurers that I deal with last year. And actually it was top of her list in terms of concerns to pass on to me, to cascade down to other facilities, people replacing matting modules and not warning the customers that there's going to be a difference in density, it's going to feel different. And her advice there was, obviously letting customers know, probably through signage, was something that would be kind of sensible. Not letting them know. She was concerned that that was something that could cause a problem if there was an injury in that particular area. I don't know, Nate, if you want to just, you're the matting guru, whether you want to comment. Would you agree broadly with that?
Yeah, I think that you should do something, and I think it's pretty common to identify if there is new mats, and to take care, whatever that means, in some form or another. But I think identifying something like that by signage or something at reception when people check in, even if they see it. I don't think you need people to sign anything or anything like that. But I definitely think identifying that would be a good idea.
Yeah, great.
Cool. Kind of a question on informed consent. How do you suggest addressing the balance that might be needed between informed consent and scaring potential new climbers? For example, climbing can be dangerous and may cause death or serious injury, especially if activities being done are only involving top rope systems, so the risk of death or serious injury are effectively non-existent, especially in relation to due diligence. That is, if something actually happened, it would be due to negligence anyway, and a signed disclaimer wouldn't cover it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. And this is, again, a question that frequently comes up, particularly with, it's one I get asked with kind of, I guess, less specialist climbing centres, where, it's more of a kind of, let's just use an example. It's not a specific example, but generically something like a clip and climb centre, where, operators are concerned that they're going to scare off people, etc., by saying you could die. Now, my advice, and I think this is something I'd also bring the insurers in, is that if you can demonstrate through risk assessment that isn't a potential outcome of the activity, then okay, I mean that would seem to be sensible. I'm not endorsing it at all, but that would seem to be okay. But I would argue that none of the activities that we're talking about here, you can completely eliminate that. And whether that then would just, if the worst did happen, quite where you'd stand by having not got folks to kind of acknowledge that. I don't know the answer to that, but it just seems a risk that's not worth taking in my mind. But that's just my opinion. That's not based on any specific case law as such. It's just my opinion.
Thanks, Joby. Question: Did you see an uptick in incidents involving outdoor climbers returning to wall as autumn set in? I certainly witnessed poor behaviour at sports crags over the summer.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Everyone's seen the social media feeds, haven't they, about all of this stuff that they've seen at Signage and other places. I mean, I don't have any sort of first-hand examples, only anecdotal kind of information on this about what people have seen, heard, etc. The ones that I suppose I could cite are more to do with equipment that people have bought from online retailers that's been inappropriate, rather than people have gone outside and kind of been subject to poor practice, or perhaps learnt things outdoors and brought them indoors. I can think of one occasion where someone, turned up to lead having bought a static rope, which they've been using outdoors, and then they came indoors and suddenly staff kind of went, "Whoa, you haven't used this, have you, for leading?" Yeah, it's been fine all summer. So that's where I've seen it happen, but only in a couple of isolated incidents. I don't have any more anecdotes on that than that.
Okay. Yeah, so if there's more questions, keep them rolling through. I'm just kind of going through the other bits here. Just a query on the matting. Do firmer mats work? Well, I'm kind of interpreting the question a little. Do firmer mats work better than softer mats? And the question is, are there better outcomes with firmer mats?
That's a Nate question, definitely.
Well, there's a couple of factors in this, and so obviously, if you have firmer mats, there's higher G forces, so there'd be more strain. But there's a threshold where you're trying to hit like a sweet spot where it's firm enough not to go deeply into it. So you might have like an ankle turning over or something like that, where it's not too firm that you have like an impact injury or something that's going to dislocate. And I think that's what the standard tries to balance, because it is different depending on different sports. so the threshold for G-forces and other things does vary depending on what the mats are used for. So it probably depends. There probably is 400 mil mats are pretty common in other countries that are generally softer, but I wouldn't be able to quantify the injury data rate for, say, Germany or something like that, where they do have or France, where there's 400 mil mats.
Okay, thanks, Nate. Just trying to scan through other questions. Know what you know about accidents, responsibilities, paperwork requirements, etc. Would you still recommend a career as a climbing instructor?
It did sound a bit black, didn't it, towards the end there? But the thing is, I mean, and I was something I was going to mention really at the start of the second session this afternoon. And actually, all of the these reports and things, comparative to participation, in my mind, are relatively low. But as operators and as instructors and coaches, the more information that people have got about what can go wrong, the more likely it is they're going to be able to preempt those things before they happen. So that's the beauty of things like this, isn't it? Have all the information, take it away, make your systems as good as possible, so it's less likely to happen to you. But these are all things that, it's a number of years of experience, isn't it? And it's the worst things that we kind of bring into the fold.
And a kind of question from a little bit earlier, but somewhat related to what you just said there, Joby. What tips would more experienced instructors give to those starting out?
That's a good question, isn't it? I mean, I think one of the points that I think I made a little bit earlier on. I mean, again, the most effective. What's the best word? Mentoring, really, is what I'll come back to. And I think, again, young instructors, freshly qualified instructors, thrown in at the deep end, I often feel quite sorry for when they don't have any steering with someone that's got a lot more experience. So, having our mentor is hugely beneficial. And I think it's something that we're talking about coaching and becoming a coach. We're quite good at doing that. But I think when people are an instructor, we just don't do it. We just let them get on with it. So having some sort of mentoring process, I would say that would be a top tip. Whether it's someone that works with you at your wall or someone that's remote that you can kind of do it, I don't think it really matters, but having that point of contact. And I mean, the other thing, just try and get as much in the way of updates and training as possible. So things like this are great, aren't they? It doesn't matter what level of experience folks have got, they're going to have got some useful information from today. The floor walking thing we've got going on next month, again, great. It's stuff that isn't included in NGBs. That would be really useful in terms of the suite of experience. And write it all down. Again, it's the common thread, isn't it, through the day? Get lots of experience, keep up to date, and keep a track of that experience. And that will also make people really employable in the future too. So keeping up to date, isn't it? That's the key thing.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Joby. Just a question that I'm going to kind of put to you, and it's around the role of a technical advisor. So I think it's something that some of the walls here use, but not all. And it's maybe a role that not everyone's familiar with. Could you give us a bit of background on the role of a technical advisor and what they can bring to any wall, and who's qualified to be in that role?
Sure. Okay. I mean, operators are required through legislation to have access to competent advice. So that's really clear, and it's in black and white. Now, what that competent advice is, it is down to the operator to make decisions on. And I'd always map things back again to discuss with insurers, etc. And it might well be that requirements of an insurance company will stipulate what level of experience or qualification that expertise might have. For example, if staff are not national governing body qualified and they're required to be certified as competent, most insurers will stipulate that a mountaineering and climbing instructor would be the appropriate person to do that for sport-led activities. And it will generally say that in black and white. So, you know, therefore you work out, okay, well, we need that person. So that's our technical expert, if you will, which is the terminology that the licensing authority are using now, technical expert rather than technical advisor. That would be the right person to come and support us with instruction at the instruction sessions. But then we also need someone who can give us some support on structural inspections and that side of things. And actually, that might not be the same person. I mean, you've got two of them sitting in the webinar here. You know, one of them is Nate and one of them is me. And we've definitely got different skill sets. And I often say that to folks more and more, that, yeah, you definitely need to have that expertise. And it might be that through operations, you're guided in terms of what skills, qualifications those people might have, but it might not be one person. You know, I wouldn't give any advice on structures. I don't go anywhere near it. Nate might choose to give advice on group supervision, but he might choose not to. He might say, actually, no, that's someone else at the moment. So the long and the roundabout house way of saying that is, you know, what do you have expertise in-house? What do you need in order to be able to operate to a safe standard? So that is that, you know, input of staffing, is input on structures, etc., etc. And then you need to go and seek out that expert advice. It might be one person, it might be more than one person. I mean, generally for a, you know, artificial climbing structure, we would always suggest that someone is involved with kind of reviewing risk management processes, operating procedures, and how they relate to climbers and groups working in a wall. Now, that generally is going to be a mountaineering and climbing instructor with artificial climbing structure experience and group supervision experience. But then not every mountaineering and climbing instructor is going to have that experience. So it has got to be down to the individual. And certainly, you know, in cases that I've dealt with where there have been poor outcomes, incidents, and, you know, Nate, I know, will nod his head to the same, where there hasn't been that technical expertise sought out. You know, we have both dealt with some pretty meaty claims where that has been a massive and obvious gap for facilities, you know, and an kind of talk outable gap. if it's not there, if people haven't sought expert advice, it's not there, and that's very, very clear. So it's both ends of the model, isn't it, really? It's the getting it right in the first place and making sure you're using the right people that everyone in the mix is happy with, and also being aware that if it goes wrong and you haven't got someone with the right expertise involved, that almost certainly will cause problems.
Okay, thanks, Ruby. And just as we're on the kind of that question of insurers, I think you may have mentioned this earlier, but somebody's asking what insurers are best at understanding the climbing wall environment. We found it a bit challenging to find people that properly understood what we were doing.
In terms of insurance brokers?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, again, you know, being a member of the ABC is probably quite useful in that respect. The fact that they've got links to the main insurers. Now, in terms of brokers, you know, where you are, Damien, I don't know. I won't confess to know, and I don't know. Certainly, I deal with, and this isn't, you know, I'm not recommending or otherwise anyone, but I deal with Town and Country, Bluefin, and AIM as the main insurers in all the facilities that I deal with. Others exist.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. Yeah. Next question, is there a legal requirement of management to ensure staff upskill or be evaluated every season or year, or is it strictly in their own behest? So legal requirement versus best practice, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really good question, and I suppose that come back to say, you know, it depends what you read into the legislation, and you can almost read anything into it. An operator is required to ensure they've got competent staff to perform the task. And how they deem that competence and how frequently people get refreshed has got to be down to, the thing we keep mentioning, the risk assessment. Now, I've given a few examples, I think, over the course of the afternoon of where I've seen, variations there. So, a clip and climb centre, really, really busy, thousands and thousands of people in terms of footfall, probably quite a few little rescues and problems. One particular centre I can think of, every 3 months, bang, 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 it's staff training. And they're comfortable with that, and that works for them. Other operators might, every couple of years do something with folks, and everything in between. I mean, certainly in terms of the advice that I give, I can't think of an occasion where there's a centre that I deal with where we wouldn't have some form of staff refresh annually. Whether it was a little update workshop or whether it was a practical thing. And that might be, the technical advisor involved, or it might be senior staff at the centre, just demonstrating that folks have been updated. So I don't know if that answers that question. I would say there's no legal requirement for a timeline of refresher. But I think if people had no kind of refreshing skills update, it could be quite difficult to justify why you made that decision.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.